It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. The invasion of Iraq, led by the U.S. and British forces, began on March 19, 2003, with these words by President Bush and former Prime Minister of UK, Tony Blair.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them, that he has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes, including against his own Shia population.
Leading up to the war in Iraq, we heard an echo chamber of rationalizations for the upcoming attack. Here is Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and Secretary of State Colin Powell.
The United States knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Any country on the face of the earth with an active intelligence program knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
One of the most worrisome things that emerges from the thick intelligence file we have on Iraq's biological weapons is the existence of mobile production facilities used to make biological agents.
It was a war that completely destroyed Iraq and changed the dynamics of the Middle East forever. During the initial invasion, which lasted about 6 weeks, 380,000 coalition troops were dispatched. 192 were from the U.S. and 45,000 were British soldiers and 70,000 were Kurdish Peshmerga troops. The Iraqi Republic's Guard were approximately the same number, but did not have the firepower of the U.S. military forces. During those initial 6 weeks, nearly 200 coalition troops were killed, and somewhere between 30 and 45,000 Iraqi troops were killed, and over 7,000 Iraqi civilians were killed. President Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney demanded a swift action and justified it by saying it was to seize Iraq's unconventional weapons, or weapons of mass destruction.
The choice is his, and if he does not disarm, the United States of America will lead a coalition and disarm him in the name of peace.
All of the experience we have points in the direction that in the past we've underestimated the extent of his program. We've underestimated the speed at which it was developing. It's important for people to understand as well, too, the difficult nature of the target here in an intelligence perspective. This is a guy who runs a totally controlled system. He doesn't have to go to Congress to get funds appropriated to build a system. It's a dictatorship. Secondly, it's a police state. He runs a very brutal regime. Third, he has been very good at denial and deception. He's good at hiding whatever he's doing from public view, and therefore, as an intelligence target, it's an especially difficult proposition for us. We have a tendency, as part of the American character, to say, well, we sit down, we evaluate the evidence, we draw a conclusion, but we always think in terms of we've got all the evidence. Here, we don't have all the evidence. We got 10%, 20%, 30%, we don't know how much. We know we have a part of the picture. And that part of the picture tells us that he is, in fact, actively and aggressively seeking to acquire nuclear weapons.
Well, it was not swift. U.S. troops stayed in Iraq and continued the war for 8 more years until 2011. Coalition casualties, including the Iraqi security forces under U.S. command and contractors from private companies, reached over 25,000 dead, with nearly 120,000 injured. Iraqi combatants suffered losses of about 37,000. Civilians, however, paid the heaviest price, with estimates ranging from 151,000 dead to over 600,000. On to discuss this devastation caused by the U.S. and UK and its coalition, I'm joined by 2 guests who have followed what happened in Iraq on a daily basis since the initial attacks. I'm joined by Medea Benjamin, co-founder of CODEPINK. Thanks for joining us, Medea.
Thanks for having me on.
And we're joined by Sabah Alnasseri, professor of political science at the Department of Political Science at York University in Toronto. Thanks for joining us today, Sabah.
Good to be with you, Sharmini.
Now, Medea, let's go back 15 years when President Bush announced that U.S. is going to war in Iraq. What were your thoughts and what did you do?
I had just returned from Iraq with a group of CODEPINK women, and we had gone there to see what women in Iraq were thinking. And we came back with the sense of urgency to try to stop the war because they were so afraid of what a war would mean to their families. Many of them obviously did not like Saddam Hussein, but certainly didn't want to be, quote, liberated by the U.S. government through bombs. And so as soon as we had come back from Iraq in February, we were organizing just feverishly. And we thought that somehow, as good American citizens, if we did our job and mobilized lots of people, that we would be able to change our government's policies. We did our job as citizens. We did mobilize tremendous mobilizations, like the largest one global mobilization in history on February 15th, 2003. But unfortunately, it was not enough to stop George Bush. And on that fateful day of March 19th, 2003, when he announced the U.S. was going to invade, I remember just running out to the White House as we had been on a 4-month vigil saying no to the war, and being met by people who had come all over from Washington, D.C., hugging each other, crying, and feeling like a disaster was in the making.
Now, Medea, describe February 15th and what we saw around the globe that didn't matter to Bush and Cheney and his administration.
It was a remarkable time when millions of people came out on the streets all over the world in one loud, beautiful voice saying the world says no to war. It went down in the Guinness Book of Records as the largest anti-war mobilization. It sent a message to governments around the world that the global community did not support this. Unfortunately, George Bush called us a focus group, although the next day the New York Times came out and said that we were the second superpower, global world opinion. And indeed, if you look not at public opinion in the United States, which was very divided, but public opinion globally was very united, saying this would be a disaster and the U.S. and its, quote, allies had no right invading Iraq.
Sabah, now in that statement on the 19th of March, President Bush said that when he was speaking to the nation, he said that U.S. forces were already underway. So that was the 20th in Iraq. What were your thoughts when you heard those bombs falling on innocent children in Baghdad, your home country?
Let me go back to Blair's statement on Iraq before the invasion, when he was saying that Saddam Hussein has a weapon of mass destruction and he used it against the Shiite population. This sectarian discourse reminded me of Bush Sr. in 1991, when he called upon the, quote, Shiite population to rise up against Saddam Hussein, again using a sectarian discourse. This is very remarkable because it is a strategy that is used by the U.S. ever since the invasion happened in March 2003 to divide the country along sectarian lines and create a conflict among these coexistent community in Iraq. It was not collateral, it was not by coincidence, it was per design. And these are the things we were afraid of before the war started, before the invasion of Iraq, looking at the documents, statements made by Bush and Blair, Rumsfeld, Cheney, and Richard Pearl and co. But also the Iraqi exile opposition, unfortunately, propagated this discourse and supported by the US and the UK to invade Iraq and to come to power. We were afraid because we knew it's not about disarming Iraq, it's not about the so-called democracy of human rights, it's not about the liberation of Iraqi women. It is about occupation, genocidal practices, massive and mass incarceration and torture, and the introduction of the politics of war, what I call war of terror. And this is exactly how it started, with the shock and awe, which is nothing but a war of terror and corruption. These two columns of the US occupation of Iraq, terror and corruption, are up until today determine the politics, the economy, and the institution and governance in Iraq.
Now, Sabah, what were your thoughts as the bombs were falling on Iraq?
Well, of course, I mean, we organized huge, massive rallies. I was at that time in Frankfurt in Germany. I used to live in Germany. And I went on the street the day or the night, actually, the bomb fall on Baghdad and Basra and other cities in Iraq. And we were marching in the street of Frankfurt with some huge, maybe the biggest anti-war rallies and maybe in the history of Germany. And sometimes while we were rallying, and I couldn't catch up with my comrades and friends, because sometimes I have to sit down and breathe, because I couldn't breathe for a while, sensing that bombs will fall. All these poor people who hate Saddam Hussein, who never elected Saddam Hussein, who was imposed on them also by the US, supported by the US, and now they have to pay the price for something, for the mistake of the US in Iraq. And so sensing that, these bombs will bomb Iraq back into the Middle Ages and probably massacre thousands and maybe 100,000 of people and displace maybe millions. This is an unimaginable scenario. So sometimes, as I said, I had to sit down and take my breath and then continue rallying, because at times I really couldn't breathe.
The Costs of War project by the Boston Institute for International Studies at Brown University estimates that the war in Iraq cost the U.S. over $2 trillion, when the costs of recovery of veterans are counted in. So now the other economists we know, Stiglitz, for example, says that the costs were more like $6 trillion. Just last month, Kuwait hosted a conference about reconstruction of Iraq, which still did not recover from any economic impact this war was supposed to produce. So give us a sense of how much did this war set back the Iraqi economy, and what were the real reasons for going to war in Iraq in the first place that wasn't said in those clips that we saw earlier today?
Right. A few months before the invasion of Iraq, when I was in Germany, I was following the conflict between the U.S. and Iraq since 1991. And in a long essay, I have termed the never-ending story, the U.S., Iraq, and the war. And I was arguing that the project of the new cons, supported by Zionists like Netanyahu, is not so much about weapon of mass destruction. They knew exactly that Iraq didn't have weapon of mass destruction. Otherwise, they wouldn't invade and make war against Iraq if Iraq had these weapons. And it's not about, less about oil, although oil plays, of course, a role, but it's less about oil. I was arguing that the strategy of the newcomers in the Middle East is to control the region through instabilities by creating more conflicts and war in the region. This is the only way they can control the region and destabilize Europe, Russia, and China. That's I think, the geopolitics of it. And if we look at the consequences of the invasion of Iraq, not only domestically, as I said, the U.S. institutionalized terror and corruption, systemic corruption. Iraq today is one of the most corrupt countries on the face of this earth. And the scope of violence and corruption, it exceeds by far all the previous regime in the modern classical history of Iraq. So this is institutionalized by the U.S. It is per design. And as you mentioned, the Reconstruction Conference in Kuwait from February 14th to the 16th, actually, the Iraqi needed something around $100 billion to reconstruct the cities after the war against Daesh or ISIS. But the countries and the corporations and NGOs, etc., involved in the conference, they pledged only $30 billion to Iraq. But most of it, that means 95% of this money, was in form of loan, sovereign and non-sovereign loans, or investment, or export credit. That means all these countries, they were trying to support their own corporation to have access to the Iraqi economy, especially oil and gas and so on, and secure contracts. But really, they are not helping Iraq, because Iraq has, according to the IMF, this year something around $137 billion debt. So all these new debts for the reconstruction will put the Iraqi economy into massive problems. And the poor people, the working class people in Iraq will pay the price because of the corruption, because of the plundering of the wealth of the country by the governments, by the governing parties, by their militias and allies within the institution, outside the institutions. And the transfer of all this wealth outside of Iraq will starve the population of Iraq for decades to come. That's domestically. But regionally, if you look at what the war and the invasion of Iraq did, it destabilized the whole region, for it shifted the balance of power to the advantage of Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, and so on. Institutionalized sectarianism, which we can see it up until today, in form of proxy wars in Iraq and Syria and Yemen, etc., etc. It introduces a new type of politics in Iraq, which is the militias. This is a new form of political organization in Iraq and in the region. We didn't have militias. It was introduced by the U.S., trained and armed by the U.S., and these militias control biggest chunk of Iraq or Syria or Yemen, Libya, etc. It introduces an enormous arms race that almost half of the U.S. export of weapons is to the region, and especially Saudi Arabia. And now it created a new crisis with the Gulf crisis between Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. And again, increases the arms sales and weapons in the region, which means it creates a new conflict, a new war, a new escalation in the region. All these are the consequences of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Speaking of consequences, Medea, on May 1st, 2003, President Bush stood on the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier under the big sign that mission accomplished, and gave a victory speech. So let's review the reasons for which Bush listed for going to war in Iraq in the first place. First, he said it was to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. I think it's safe to say that none of these goals have been achieved, nor weapons of mass destruction were found. and the people of Iraq are certainly not free, and former members of the Ba'ath Party have joined organizations like ISIS, and it's hard to claim that the invasion of Iraq defended the world from great danger. And if you take all this into consideration and what Sabah just said, what were the costs of going to war in Iraq for Iraqis, for Americans, for the world over, really?
One of the most depressing things I have seen on this 15th anniversary is a new Pew study looking at American attitudes towards this war, and a massive percentage, 43%, which I consider massive, said that it was the right decision. It should be 1% perhaps, the most ignorant people thinking it's the right decision. As Sabah explained, Iraq is a total disaster to this day, and we have not even talked about the number of deaths. I just wrote a piece trying to estimate how many Iraqis have been killed, because Tommy Franks, the general, said early on in the invasion, we don't do body counts. But, you know, what if the result after the Holocaust in Germany was the world saying, well, we don't do body counts? No, we should do body counts. And the U.S. has tried during the entire time since the invasion till today to refuse to talk about the number of Iraqis killed, whether it was by the U.S. or as an outcome from the U.S. invasion. And so we looked at the Lancet report that had been done back in 2006 that said 600,000 Iraqis had been killed. And this report, done by very professional people in a very professional journal, was pilloried by the U.S. government to say that it was totally exaggerated. And yet, again, the U.S. would not give its own figures. So we updated that using the same methodology. One would say that there were about 2.4 million Iraqis who have been killed as a result of this invasion. Now, I challenge the U.S. government, if they say that is a wild exaggeration, well, give us your own account of what has been the death toll since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And that's not even talking about all of the wounded, the 4 million who have been displaced, the economic losses for the Iraqi people. We tend to talk about what it has cost us here at home. And indeed, there have been thousands of U.S. lives lost in Iraq and trillions of U.S. dollars. That really put the emphasis on what the poor Iraqi people have suffered since that invasion. The shamefulness that there are still 43% of Americans who say it was worth it, and the shame that nobody has been held accountable for invading Iraq on the basis of lies and absolutely destroying that country and unleashing, as Sabah said, this sectarian division not only throughout Iraq, but through the entire region.
Medea, one very unique feature that's prominent in the war in Iraq is the heavy use of private military and security companies, or PMSCs, I believe, what they are called. And Blackwater and Eric Prince became famous in that way in which we fought wars. And they weren't the only company that was used by the U.S. Now, in terms of contractors, at some point, they actually outnumbered the U.S. troops. So give us a sense of how this scenario of using contractors played out in this war, and of course, what it meant for the civilians on the ground in Iraq.
Well, let's remember that Halliburton got enormous contracts for the Iraq war even before it started. They knew that this was going to happen, and they had put in their bids. And ever since then, whether it is the weapons manufacturers, the security forces, or the Pentagon contractors like Halliburton, they certainly made a killing out of killing. And they have not been held accountable if there were security forces like Blackwater that massacred innocent Iraqis, like in Nisour Square, or just the fact that all of these countries were profiting from an illegal war with contracts that were cost plus, which meant they could not lose, and oftentimes such shoddy work that then they were fined by the US government. But being fined for shoddy work did not mean they wouldn't get a new contract. In fact, they kept getting new contracts. So while the US taxpayer lost what turns out to be trillions of dollars in a war that was not supposed to cost us a cent because it was going to be so quick and so cheap, and the Iraqis were going to pay for it with their oil money, really cost us a massive amount of money, but made a lot of money for the private contractors.
All right, Sabah, let me actually give you an opportunity to assess the situation in Iraq now. The war is considered past tense, but the soldiers in the U.S., from the U.S. remain, some of them in Iraq. We are hearing still bombs are falling on Iraq. What's the situation, and what is the political conditions that U.S. has left behind that Iraqis are struggling with now?
There are three issues, I would say now, 2 months before the election in Iraq. The first one is after the Iraqi army and the popular mobilization units defeated ISIS or Daesh in Mosul, in Tikrit, Fallujah, Ramadi, etc., and kicked out Daesh from Iraq, all of a sudden we hear attacks from Daesh again, and especially at the western border of Iraq, between Iraq and Syria. So the question is, where did they come? Who supplied them with weapons? And why all of a sudden, after they were defeated, they can wage attack again? This is a big question mark. And if we look at who controls the other side of the border in Syria and Iraq, you will see it's the allies of the United States. So this is the first thing that creates a lot of concerns in Iraq, because people fear, again, some suicide bombing in the cities and so on, especially before the election. The second issue is, of course, the question of corruption. We have massive protest movements in Iraq since years. Young people, unemployed, mostly working class people, from all classes and currents in Iraq, from all sects and religions and ethnicities. And they went on the street demanding better services, and especially to end up corruption and bring those who plundered the wealth of Iraq to justice. And the Minister President Abadi, since months, he promised people that he will go ahead with these corruption files. He will bring these people to court and they will be prosecuted, etc. Nothing happened. This created a lot of frustration and a lot of potential for conflict and violence within the next few months. The third question is the issue of ISIS. There's a big debate in Iraq around 2014 when al-Maliki was the minister president, who is now the vice president, and he is again want to be elected as a minister president. He was in charge of the Iraqi army at that time as the minister president, as a commander-in-chief, and the Iraqi army withdrew from the cities and enabled Daesh to occupy the cities. So there's a big debate how much al-Maliki and the in-charge generals and officers under his commands and some militias, Kurdish militia, the Peshmergas, are actually part of this scenario. That means they committed treason vis-a-vis Iraq and the Iraqi people to secure, for al-Maliki to secure the election in 2014 and for the al-Barzani in Kurdistan to occupy the contested territories between Iraq and Kurdistan, using Daesh to enable Peshmerga to enter these cities. So the big debate about this issue, and none of these people was brought to justice or held accountable or prosecuted. So people are frustrated for the lack of services, continuation of corruption, and especially now before the election, the same parties and the same militias, especially the so-called the Shiite militia, the people mobilization units, now they are entering, especially the heads of these units, entering the election with their own parties, supported by Iran. That means none of the people involved in corruption or in the file of 2014 of ISIS will be prosecuted. And now these parties and militias, with the enormous amount of money they plundered from Iraq, they are buying the votes of people 2 months before the election, bribing poor people who have nothing to eat, give them some money, and promise them some jobs and so on to secure their votes before even the election starts or the election campaigning starts. That means, again, corruption at a different level. That people had hopes that this coming election would be a turning point in Iraq, that different parties, different representatives of the people will make it to the parliament and to the executive and probably, prosecute corrupt ministers and Mr. Presidents and companies, etc., and represent the demand of the people in Iraq despite their different sects of religion or ethnicity and so on. But people are now so pessimistic and so resignated and frustrated that the same old scenario since 2003, introduced and institutionalized by the US, will be reproduced again, which is a pre-programmed disaster.
We talk about the war in Iraq. We talk about it as having changed the dynamics and political relations and configurations in the region. But U.S. has not really left Iraq still yet. In fact, I believe just last week, 7 U.S. soldiers were killed in a helicopter crash over Iraq. So what are U.S. troops still doing there? And what do you make of the claim made by, say, right-wing leaders such as Prime Minister Netanyahu that says that if Iraq has not been conquered, it would be used as a pawn by Iran? How has these involvements by the U.S. changed the dynamics in the region politically?
In general, what it has done, ironically, is give Iran more strength. The U.S. is still there because they're trying to keep Iran from having that much influence inside of Iraq. But let's face it, because of the U.S. invasion and taking out Saddam Hussein and putting in a Shia government, Iran has more influence in Iraq today. So certainly this is an outcome that Netanyahu did not want to see. And I think the lesson that should be drawn from the U.S. that invasions are not something that allows the U.S. to implement the kind of government that it wants seems to be lost on the people in power today when you're getting folks like Mike Pompeo to become the Secretary of State, the same Mike Pompeo who was a cheerleader for the war in Iraq. When Trump is listening to the same neocons right now that should, as far as I'm concerned, either be in jail or banned from government, are now the ones who are talking about the U.S. should get out of the nuclear deal with Iran and have a military option. So it's mind-boggling to me, Sharmini, that people don't look at the state of Iraq and the region today and say the U.S. Military should stay as far away as possible and U.S. should lose its diplomatic powers. But I think that just attests to the power of the military-industrial complex and the neocons who are never held to account for the invasion of Iraq.
All right, Medea, thank you so much for joining us on this 15th anniversary of the war in Iraq, commemoration of the war in Iraq, I should say. And Sabah Alnasseri, a political science at York University, I thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.